Welcome to Rogers That Podcast, episode 39. I'm Lily,
I'm Julia. And I'm Katarina.
and today we have a great opportunity to interview David DesRoches, who is a podcast professor at Quinnipiac University. Welcome, David. Thank you for taking the time to talk with us today. Our goal is to help our viewers learn more about potential jobs and careers in our community. We really appreciate you joining us.
Well, I'm happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Can you tell us a little bit about yourself? Where are you from?
I'm originally from Virginia, and I went to school in South Carolina. I lived abroad for a little bit, and I've been in Connecticut for 13 years now.
What was your inspiration for deciding on a career as a professor?
Well, I was a journalist for 10 years before becoming here to the university in 2019. And I just really love the idea of working with young people. I feel like you guys are just so full of life and energy. The world hasn't beaten you down yet, like us old folks, like we get, kind of cynical, but being around young people just really energizes me and gives me hope. And also, I feel like there is an opportunity to not just throw a bunch of knowledge at you and think of you as like this empty vessel that I'm supposed to fill with a bunch of stuff, but that that we are together building things together. We are building the ship. We are building the vessel together. And, I'm kind of learning from my students as I guide them on their path. And so I think it's kind of a two-way street. It's not just me kind of blurting out all this information. So I just really like the collaboration. I really like the learning that I get, right, from working with students. And I think it's just a great opportunity to be around young energy and ideas and creativity and positive energy. And it's something that I really appreciate and love.
Can you describe your job as a college professor who teaches podcasting classes?
Sure. So the two main classes that I teach are the art of the podcast, which is, as it sounds, is basically how do you start a podcast? How do you create it from the beginning and pre-production through production, recording, editing, mixing. And then we also talk about marketing and the business side of things. So it's everything from A to Z from podcast making and production and promotions. And then I also teach a class called audio storytelling, which is, so as a journalist, audio storytelling is journalism focused. So it's similar to podcasting, except there's not fiction, right? It's all truth based storytelling. And so that's a bit of a different animal than podcasting. When you're having a fun conversation, you don't necessarily have to think about being right all the time. If you're just stating your opinions, right? Your opinions are one thing, but if you're a journalism, if your podcast is journalistic based, or if it's truth based, you have to kind of check your facts, right? You have to make sure what you're saying is true and it's accurate. So they're kind of two different things. And so basically we have smaller classes here at Quinnipiac. So the students will, in the podcasting class, they produce a number of different podcasts over the course of the semester. They start out telling a sound story, which is basically using 7 sounds alone in one spoken word to tell a story. So if you think about how would you do something like that? Well, think about telling the story of somebody texting and driving and getting into a car accident. Well, you could play sounds of somebody opening their door, right? You hear the door of the car open, you hear it close, you hear the key turning, you hear the engine start, you hear them drive off. Then you hear like the texting sounds, right? Then you hear maybe a horn go, and you hear like a screech and then a crash and then somebody screaming, and then you hear the ambulance come. So all those sounds tell the story. You don't need words to tell the story. So I think that's how we kind of start out the class. And it sets the tone for how do sounds work to tell the stories. I think when you guys talk about podcasting, you probably just talk about people sitting in a room and talking, right? Like that's what most podcasts are. But they can be a lot more than that, right? They can incorporate all different kinds of sounds. They can incorporate music, scoring, sound effects, special effects. You do all kinds of fun things with sounds to bring your podcast to the next level. So that's what I try to teach early on. Start out with this idea that podcasting is more than just having a conversation, that it's about how you're thinking about sound itself and how that can tell the story. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Is one of them more difficult to teach than the other?
Well, the audio storytelling class, the journalism one, is much more serious. I mean, I try to have fun anyway. I think, professors that are not interested in having fun may be a little bit boring. So I try to, have a little bit of fun, but because it's strictly journalism based, have to get kind of into the weeds on some of the journalism stuff, which can be a little tricky, because especially if you're talking about ethical situations in which there's not a clear right answer, when you're doing recording and stuff like that, that probably can be a little bit more tricky, but I enjoy both of them. And the podcasting class has its own set of challenges.
And what's your work schedule like?
So get up, I come to work, I arrive, and then, so technically, I'm an adjunct professor. So that what that means is that my teaching is secondary to my actual job here at the university. So my actual job is director of community programming, which means that I am responsible for the podcast studio and the podcasts that the university creates across the university, across the campus, right? So we have students from different schools. We have students from our medical school. They do podcasts. We have students that are they do a podcast about anthropology called The Anthrophiles, which is really, really cool. We have students in the physician's assistance program doing podcasts. We have students from the business school. So we have a lot of different podcasts from different schools. And also we have podcasts from people in the community. So people who are not actually part of the university will come here to podcast. We have a podcast called Talk to Ma, which is a woman from New Haven. It's a podcast where she talks to teenagers about issues that they're dealing with. We have a podcast called Pilot Language with a guy named Ra, who's also from New Haven. It's about his experience as a formerly incarcerated Black man and how he's kind of introducing himself into the world. And so we have a lot of different podcasts that I kind of oversee. So that's my actual job. The teaching part is secondary. So that's something I do in addition to the podcast stuff. So it's a lot of kind of boring administrative stuff and emailing and making sure things sound good and talking to people and stuff like that. And then, from the teaching side, that's obviously, prepping for the classes and all that kind of stuff. So on any given day, whether I'm teaching or not, I'm doing kind of all the kind of boring administrative stuff. But then on teaching days, right, I'm in the classroom, I'm doing the prep work and all that kind of stuff. And I'm also produce my own work as well at the university. So there's a lot of just doing podcasting. Like right now, I'm producing a podcast on my trip to Mexico for the World Summit of Nobel Peace Laureates. So there were students from like 60 countries. There's like, I don't know, 1,000 students or more from all over the world at the summit. And there were Nobel laureates from around the world and some really incredible people there. And so I interviewed a lot of people, a lot of students, and I'm putting together a 5-part podcast series based on that. And so in addition to all the other stuff, I also do production. So I'm doing my own writing, my own scripting, my own mixing, my own sound. Also, I'm a musician, so I do my own music for my podcast. So it just depends on what I'm working on. The days can be very administrative, or sometimes in the classroom, or sometimes I'm on my computer, working on Adobe Audition, doing the editing and the writing and all that kind of stuff.
How did you become the director of podcasting at Quinnipiac University?
So I was at the public radio station, Connecticut Public in Hartford for 5 years. And I was looking around and I stumbled upon this job, director of community programming at Quinnipiac. And I was like, wow, this is interesting, because Quinnipiac was very forward thinking, because this was 2019. They really saw that podcasting was this growing medium, and it's the fastest growing still today, the fastest growing medium among all kinds of media, among television, writing, you name the kind of media that's out there. Podcasting is just going crazy. And during the pandemic, it really went crazy, right? Because everybody's stuck at home. So many people wanted to do exactly what you guys are doing, right? Do podcasting virtually. So Quinnipiac was early adopter of podcasting. They saw that it was growing, that it was something that they should pay attention to. And so they created this position. So a lot of universities at that time, they were podcasting, but they didn't have somebody like me. They didn't have somebody who was just going to focus on podcasting, right? So Quinnipiac, I think, was ahead of the curve with that. They saw that it was this growing medium. And when I saw the job, I was like, this is incredible. So I was doing journalism. I was covering education for the Connecticut Public radio station. And I was also teaching at the high school, the Journalism and Media Academy High School in Hartford as well. So I had experience teaching, and I was in the education space as an education reporter. So it made sense to come here. I saw this out as a really, really incredible opportunity to be in higher education, to work with older students, and then also get into teaching. So and at the same time, do the podcasting, right? Really focus on building a podcasting program through really looking at podcasting as a way to really tell important stories, but in a professional way. Like you guys probably know, like when you guys wanted to start podcasting, you were like, hey, let's set up a camera and let's have some conversations, right? You can do that. You can make it really simple, right? You don't have to go crazy. But I think what Quinnipiac was trying to do, and maybe what you guys are trying to do by having this conversation with me, is try to take it up a notch, right? Because there's so many podcasts out there, right? There's the millions and millions of podcasts. And if how do you stand out, right, as a podcaster? How do you make people want to listen to you? And I think Quinnipiac was like, how do we do that? Let's hire somebody to be serious about it. So we're not just sitting around having conversations, which is great, right? There's nothing wrong with that. But how do we stand out, right? How do we make it a little bit better? How do we take it up a notch? And so I think that opportunity was really appealing to me.
What does it take to be a podcast professor?
A podcast professor. Well, I think first, a couple of things maybe. I think a sense of adventure, a sense of creativity, fun. And I tell my students this all the time. If you're not having fun podcasting, like I hope you guys are having fun. Like I'm not seeing you guys smile too much. Maybe this is boring. I don't know. But like I think it should be fun, right? You should enjoy the art and the act of podcasting. Because I think that's what makes it interesting to people, is that when you're listening, the people that are talking seem to be having fun, right? They seem to be having a good time. They're enjoying the conversation like friends would, right? And I think that is what gives it value, is that it doesn't have this really polished, perfect sound. Like if you watch TV or you watch like a news show on TV, they sound like professionals, right? They're talking very clean and they don't hem and haw, right? Everything they say just fits. But in podcasts, it's like, I don't know, they're like hemming and hawing, and they're saying a lot, and they say stuff they shouldn't say, but they keep it in because that's how people talk, right? And so I tell my students, there should be a level of fun, number one. So the professor should have that as well. Like the professor should want to have fun. So a level of fun, creativity, openness, open-mindedness, because there's a lot of different things you can do with podcasting, right? And if you're open to new ideas, you can kind of explore that. So being creative, having fun, being open, being conscientious, and just being kind of a good person. Like I think, when you start to tell people about your podcast, the tendency is like, oh, I got this podcast and it's so cool, you guys should listen to it. But why would somebody want to listen to it because you said that, right? What I tell my students is like, if you're a good person, like if you're just like a genuinely kind person and you're nice to people, and that's the person you represent online, like in social media, how are you kind and nice on social media? How like, what does that look like? And to me, it says when you're on social media, you're talking nicely about other people, right? You're being like, oh, check out this podcast. These guys are awesome. Right? Or, hey, I listened to this episode on this podcast. It was really cool. You guys should go check it out. So you become a person. Your image online is this nice person because you're trying to help other podcasters, right? Instead of being like, hey, everybody listen to me, you're like, hey, this podcast is great. And then you become known as somebody who's nice, who cares about the podcasting community. So I think a professor as well, that's a good skill to have, is that just being a nice person, right? And that that the success of your students is based on encouraging them to find their inner nice person as well. And let that be the image that you project to the world, because that's going to help you find more success, no matter what you do, whether it's podcasting, whether open a restaurant or whatever you want to do with your life. I think being nice goes a long way.
Yeah, I agree. That's why I wanted to come on, even though I was at home.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you're here.
What should a professional podcast look or sound like?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, I think you guys probably know, like it depending on what you're listening to, some podcasts are really, what they're talking about is really interesting, but maybe it doesn't sound so great. And some podcasts sound really, really great, but they're not that interesting. So I think it's maybe a mixture of that, right? Where you are paying attention to the sound. You really do care about the sound quality. And also what you're talking about is interesting and you're adding something to the conversation, right? I think a lot of podcasts, they just kind of repeat stuff over and over again. So when you're thinking about, like I tell my students that want to do sports podcasts, a lot of them want to do sports podcasts. They're very into sports. Well, I say, like, there's a million podcasts about sports. How are you going to do something a little bit different? Right. So I had one of my students did a podcast about the history of the 3-point shot in the NBA. I was like, that's really cool. You could do a whole podcast about the history of the evolution of the game. Like, where did 3-point shot come from? How did they know how far to put it? Right. Or when did the layup become a thing? Or who was the first person to dunk? So that's a really specific podcast. And I think when you're specific, when your idea is very narrowly focused in podcasting, you can find a little bit more success. So I think professional podcasts sound good. They're interesting. And they're telling a little bit of a different story. They're taking a little bit of a different approach to the topic that they're covering. So, and I think, generally speaking, a professionally made podcast should have some sort of sound element beyond people talking, right? Usually there's music, right? There's an intro music and the outro music. That's pretty common, but some sort of sound element in addition to the talking that levels it up. So it sounds pretty good. You care about the sound. The conversation is interesting. You're adding something to the conversation, and that there's more to the listening experience than just a bunch of people talking. I would say that's a pretty good recipe for a good podcast.
How did your school build the podcast studio? What items are necessary to make a studio?
So we have 2 studios. One of them is very simple and one of them is complicated, right? And I think when you're setting up a podcast studio, and I was talking to your teacher about this, you can make it really simple or you can get really into the weeds and make it complicated. So we have kind of both versions. So the complex one has a mixing board with a bunch of different channels. So you got those faders and stuff, and you have to turn that on, and you have to turn the fader up, and it's connected to a microphone. And then you have microphone levels and, all these different things that you need to think about, which is great if you really want a lot of control, right? If what you care about is controlling everything, then you would want to get something like that, right? Where you have this external mixing board, external microphones that have pretty good gain, meaning that they're responsive to your voice. You don't have to crank it up a lot. You don't have to get really close to the microphone to be heard. So microphones, like a mixing board, all the necessary cables. And then you can take it from there. If you want to have conversations like we're having remotely, but you want to have it sound really good, you can get a piece of equipment called a Comrex or an ISDN line. They're really expensive, but if those pieces of equipment can make it sound like you're having a conversation in studio with that person, even though you're virtual, you're separate. So that's also something you can use. You can incorporate music. So if you have like a keyboard that you can set up that you can play music or sound effects live, you can do that. Obviously, you need some sort of recording software or computer with the recording software to record the sound, right? So computer software, mixing board, cables, microphones. And then you guys are doing a video podcast, so you probably want cameras, right? You probably want some pretty nice cameras. And so you probably want all the equipment for that as well, right? So like a switcher, if you're going to have if the cameras are going to be remotely operated, like so you're going to need that control system. So that's the complex studio. But you also in that environment, you also need soundproofing. So you have to think about that stuff, right? Like how loud is the room? That's called the noise floor. So the noise floor is, what does your room sound like right now? So if we stop talking and you just listened, like, what do you hear? What are sort of the things you hear in the room you're in right now? Do you hear, is there air coming through your house? Is there like a fan going? Is there a refrigerator going? Or, what sort of things? That's called a noise floor, right? So every room has a noise floor. That means the baseline sound of the room when nothing else is happening, right? So in a professional studio, you want a really low noise floor, so you don't have a lot of noise going on in the room. And then in the simple studio, basically have a thing called a roadcaster. I don't know what are you guys using for recording? You use the system, but do you guys, if you're not interviewing somebody, do you guys have a system for recording?
We usually use Mr. Bettish's phone.
Okay, that works. And that's what's cool too, is that nowadays, this is a podcast studio. All right, you can put it down, hit record, and that becomes the podcast, a podcast. It could, right? So you can keep it really simple, right? You can do stuff like this. You can just use your phone, or you can get that crazy studio is just talking about, or kind of a middle ground studio is what we have is our second studio. It's called with a Rodecaster, which is basically this device that has everything built into it. You don't need a computer. You don't need all the other stuff. It's basically a mixer, a recording system, and you have external microphones, right? But it's all built into this one fun box. And so if you wanted to like take that box somewhere to a classroom or, take it home, like it's really easy to carry around. So that's also something you can do as well. So again, it's you can do it really simply. You can do it on your phone. You can do it really, really complex, like the system we have at the main podcast studio, or then you can kind of be in the middle somewhere with the Rodecaster, which is what we have at the McMahon studio here on campus.
How much is podcasting going to grow in a couple of years?
That's a really interesting question. So if you look at the Edison State of Sound report, so Edison is a company that tracks all this stuff. You'll see that in 2020, the number of podcasts just ballooned really high. So it's been growing every year since podcasts became a thing in the early 2000s. Every year has been growing. And then in 2020, they went really high because of the pandemic. They plateaued a little bit, and now they might have gone down 1 year in the past 4 years. I think we're either going to see a plateau or a very subtle increase, because I think the market is very, very saturated right now with podcasts. I think it's almost become a joke, right? Like if you don't have a podcast, then there's something wrong with you, Like everybody seems to have a podcast. So I'm not sure it's going to continue growing at the rate that it has. If it does continue growing at the rate that it has been growing, that just means it's even harder for us, for you guys, and for me as well, to find success because there's more competition. And so I'm not sure if it'll continue to grow, but it seems like it's going to plateau or slow down its growth. But that doesn't mean you guys should stop podcasting, right? That definitely not. Like do it no matter what. If you love doing it, that's what you should be doing.
How much money can you make in the podcasting career?
Oh, wow. That's tricky. It depends. So the sort of baseline number you should shoot for is an average of 1,000 downloads per episode. Now, just to be clear, that doesn't sound like that much, but if you average 1,000 downloads per episode, you're in the top 1% of podcasts. 99% or 98% of podcasts, well, actually 90% of podcasts get 100 or fewer downloads per episode. So the vast majority of podcasts are not getting more than 100 listens. And when I say downloads, I just mean listens, right? Per episode. So if you can get to 1,000, that puts you in the top 1%. And that's what advertisers want. If you want to make money, you have to show that you have an audience, right? And advertisers, if you're going to use advertisers to make money, which is how most podcasts make money, there are other ways which we can talk about, but usually it's through ads. So if you have a podcast and it's about Barbie, you could go to Mattel and be like, hey, Mattel, I got 1,000. I'm averaging 1,000 downloads per episode, and Mattel, and my podcast is about Barbie. Would you like to sponsor it? And they'd be like, maybe. You have an audience that is significant, right? That's kind of the base threshold. But even if you get to 1,000 downloads per episode, it's hard to get much money for that level. Like that, you can get a little bit, maybe like 30 or $90 for a 30-second ad spot. So to really make money, you have to be in the top, top 20 or top 50 of all time podcasts, because those are the ones that are really going to make money. And that's when you can kind of command how much money you want to make. So either you're going to make just a little bit, right? And there are some podcasts where you might make decent money, like somewhere in the middle, like you're maybe in the top 0.5%, right? Maybe you averaging like 30 or 40,000 downloads per episode. You could get a little bit more money, but it's tricky. Another way you can go about it is you can approach foundations to get what's called an underwriting grant. So they would basically say, hey, here's $100,000 to do a podcast about the history of dolls. And, Barbie would be, part of that history that you would create, right? So there are different ways to go about it, different ways to monetize. You can also do Patreon. You can do crowdfunding, Kickstarter, stuff like that. So you can ask, your listeners to donate money. But to really actually make a living, you have to be really, really good. And you have to have a lot of audience members to be able to actually make a reasonable living. So I would say you probably want to be averaging 100,000 downloads per episode or more if you wanted to do that as your career.
How do you gain listeners for a podcast?
So that is the probably the hardest thing for podcasters. I tell my students, like, the easy thing is having the conversation, right? You're having the conversation, you're having a good time. It's something you want to talk about, right? You're doing a podcast about something that interests you. The hard part is exactly that. How do you get people to listen? And I kind of talked about this before when I mentioned your online presence, right? So when you're on social media, how are you presenting yourself? What is your online persona? Who are you online? And the podcasting community online is very, very connected. So they do things called affiliate marketing. So you guys might have heard this on the podcast you listen to. What kind of podcasts are you guys listening to?
I usually don't listen to podcasts.
Okay. Well, anybody else listening?
No, not really.
Not really. Okay. Well,
I've listened to ours that we've recently made.
okay. Well, let me ask you this. You guys are having me on, right? I'm a podcaster. This is exactly what I'm talking about. So it's called affiliate marketing. So it's when podcasters help each other out. So if there's another podcast out there that's like Roger that, right? You would reach out to them. Maybe it's another high school in Connecticut and they're doing something similar. You guys could be like, hey, would you guys come on our podcast and we'll talk about your podcast and then we can go on your podcast and talk about our podcast. So podcasters are really good about that kind of thing. It's called affiliate marketing, helping each other out. So when you're online, you're on Instagram and Twitter are still really big, or X. They're still kind of the big social media platforms for podcasters. TikTok as well, but I think still Instagram and X or Twitter. I hate calling it X. I don't know why. I think they're still kind of the main place where podcasters are interacting. So it's your social media presence, right, is really everything when you're growing an audience. Who are you online? How are you taking your content? So like take like from this podcast, you would listen to it and you might take like the coolest 30 seconds of this podcast and you would turn that into an audiogram. So that's, those snippets that you hear on like TikTok or something like that, just like a 30-second to 1 minute clip that you hashtag and that you post and that you share. But in addition to that, so that's how you're sharing your content. But again, in addition to doing that, you're sharing other people's content, other podcasts that you listen to. So if you really want success, if you really actually want to grow an audience, like you genuinely want to do that, you have to put in that time and effort to be part of the podcasting community. You can't just make podcasts and then post to TikTok or Instagram a clip of the podcast. You can do that, but the chances that you're going to grow an audience are very, very slim. You have to do other things. It takes a lot of work. It's like everything in life, right? The amount of work you put in usually is equal to the success you get from that work. If you just want to do the podcasting, that's like the minimum level of work. You're going to have the minimum level of success. That's just how it is, right? But if you want more success, you have to put in more work, right? You have to really focus on your online presence. You have to focus on being part of the community, helping other people online, becoming known as a person that cares, right? And it's hard. That's why not a lot of people find success podcasting. That's why most podcasts end after 10 or 12 episodes, because people they do the thing, they have fun doing it, but they can't get an audience. And to get an audience is hard. You have to really do that extra work.
We're on episode 38.
That's awesome. I love that. So you guys are doing the work, right? You're going through, you're learning stuff, I imagine, right? What are some cool things you guys have learned as you've been doing this?
We've been learning a lot of stuff about new jobs and careers. So the first time we started this podcast, we were learning about state representatives and stuff.
And like politics, we were like interviewing people who like were running. I interviewed Michelle Coelho with Julia
That's so cool.
and Katerina.
That's so cool.
There was also Bradley Colts, Julie Kushner, and other people
We
like
also
that.
did Matt Corey.
Yeah, Matt Corey too.
That's so cool. So you guys have been learning as you're doing this, right?
Yeah.
I love that. So, I mean, that's a thing that you can talk about, or that's also a connection you might have with other podcasts,
Yeah,
So, yeah.
And we've grown a lot because we started by making videos in our classroom, but now we got our own room.
I love that. I love that. So commitment to the podcast. You guys are already committed. You've done 38 episodes. That's clear, right? And that's being consistent. And also, a lot of these podcasting lessons and things we're talking about apply to other things as well, right? So whether you end up podcasting as a career or doing something else, these skills, talking, communicating, being curious, asking questions, right? Following your curiosity is super important. Like I tell my students all the time, when you're interviewing somebody, don't go down your list of questions. Follow your curiosity. If somebody says something, you're like, that was interesting, or that was unexpected. That's a signal. That's a clear signal. Your intuition, listen to that. Listen to your intuition saying, that was really cool. That's the thing you need to talk about next, not the next question on your list. You can always come back to the list, right? But follow that curiosity. What is the thing that person just said that made you go, huh? Pay attention to that. The more you listen to that voice in your head, the better of a communicator you'll be. And no matter what career you're in, communication is essential, right? So paying attention, listening, having conversations, commitment, persistence, right? You guys are already doing that. You're persistent, you're committed. You've done 38, 39 episodes. That's clear. So those are all really important life skills, no matter what you end up doing. Did we get a little bit off topic? I'm sorry.
It's okay.
What kind of classes can students take to get credit in podcasting, and how are those classes different from each other?
So currently we only offer the art of the podcast as a podcasting class. In the audio storytelling class, I also teach, we use the podcast studio, but it's not a podcasting class per se. It's more about, again, audio storytelling. So it's journalistically based. So we have taught, or I have taught in the past, advanced podcasting. So it's like you take all the students who have taken the art of the podcast as a prerequisite, and then the advanced podcasting class says, okay, now we're going to take your idea that you came up with in the first class, the prerequisite class, and you're going to do like 5 or 6 episodes throughout the semester on that one. And you're going to build that podcast brand, just like you guys are doing with Rogers That, right? You're just going to do episodes about that podcast that you like. And so, we've done that before, and maybe we'll offer that again. So, we don't offer, and there are other classes like in the English department and in the film department where they're incorporating audio into their curricula, into certain classes.
Are the classes like all year round, or are they just like a certain part of the year?
So the art of the podcast is both semesters. So, in college you have, the spring semester and the fall semester. So currently we're in the fall semester. And so the art of the podcast runs for both semesters, and then the audio storytelling only runs in the fall.
Have your students ever had someone important or special come on their podcast?
I think everybody's important and special. So yes. You mean like somebody famous or somebody?
Yeah.
Somebody like well-known.
Somebody well-known?
Or like really popular.
I don't know that I can recall. I mean, we have a good relationship with ESPN. So there is one ESPN host who is working with our athletics department to do a podcast. I can't recall his name. And so we also had, our hockey team, they were the NCAA Division I champions last year. So we did a podcast. Cool. Yeah, that was really cool. We beat Minnesota in overtime. That was a really cool podcast. So we had the head coach and some of the students on, and because they were famous at the time.
I'm going to interview, do you know the Hat-Tricks?
No.
Like, it's the Danbury Hat-Tricks. They're one of our local hockey teams.
Oh, cool.
They're like semi-pros. And I emailed one of them, and I got email back for yesterday. So we might interview them someday this week.
That's awesome. I love that. Well, good luck with that.
Thank you.
You a hockey fan?
Yeah.
That's so cool.
How do your students usually get people to come on their podcasts, and what topics do they discuss about?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
How do your students usually get people to come on their podcasts, and what topics do they discuss about?
So, and that can take, it can happen in all different kinds of ways, right? You DM somebody on Instagram, you email them, phone call, you listen to a podcast that they did, you email them, or you meet them in real life. I think all different kinds of ways of getting guests. I mean, like your teacher emailed me, right? And I think that's probably the most common, is just emailing somebody that you find and you find interest. Is that how you guys connected with the hockey team as well, just through email? Yeah. So I think most people are doing it through email. I'm sorry, what was the second part of the question? How are they getting, how are they asking people? And then what was the other part?
Then what topics do they discuss?
Oh, so most of our students are very sports centered. So a lot of them are doing sports podcasts. I'm trying to think what other ones. One of them did a Disney podcast. That was kind of fun.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, it was really cool. She's actually going to work at Disney as an intern.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I'm excited for her.
Dream job.
Yeah, right. See, I've had students do podcasts about Formula One racing, local racing. Have a student doing a satirical news podcast. Like I mentioned, the Anthrophiles. There's an anthropology podcast. That podcast is so interesting because they talk about the history of anthropology, which might sound kind of boring, but anthropology is really kind of fascinating. It's the history of us as a species. So they find these really weird cases of people doing really strange things, and it's kind of like a mystery podcast. It's really kind of fun.
Do they do it in like groups or like one person?
This is a group. So it's a group of students, and they kind of pick a topic, and then they talk about it. And I think it's really interesting. So students do podcasts about all different kinds of things. Really, it's just it's what and that's the thing about podcasting. It should be a thing that you want to talk about, right? I tell my students all the time, don't do something you think I'll like. Like that's immediately, you're failing. That's, you guys are in middle school. So there's a lot of pressure to kind of, be the person you think people want you to be, right? Because you're still kind of figuring things out. Well, that kind of mentality stays with you throughout your whole life. As you get older, you kind of learn how to manage it. And I think sometimes students are like, what does my teacher want to hear? Like, what do they want? And I was like, no. This is about you. This is about how you want to express yourself and talk about a thing that you're interested in. So I'm always telling them, you have to be interested in it. Like, it might bore me to death as a professor, but that's okay. I'm not going to grade you based on whether I'm bored. I'm going to grade you based on whether I think you're doing a good job on all the other stuff that we talk about, right? Following up, being curious, paying attention to the sound, right? That's what I'm going to grade on, right? So I'm not thinking about, am I being enamored as a professor listening to this? Am I sucked into the story? Not necessarily, right? I mean, if I am, that's great. But if I'm not, that's not necessarily bad, right? I'm really paying attention to how you put it together and whether or not you are clearly interested in what you're talking about. I think that's the number one thing.
How do you grade it?
So I tell my students this too. There's a lot of subjectivity. You guys know that word, subjectivity, when you're talking about stuff? Yeah?
Yeah.
So it's my opinion, right? So it's what I think about the podcast, which is, I might think one thing one day and I might think something else the next day. So I make sure that I'm clear about that there is a significant amount of subjectivity in the grading of podcasts, but there are also objective things, bless you, such as, the sound quality. Can I hear everybody okay, right? Is it noisy? Do you mix levels appropriately, right? Is the music too loud? Is the music too soft? Is the fade out too long? Is it too abrupt? When you edit, are you editing cleanly, or are you editing and leaving audio artifacts? In other words, do you guys ever cut parts out of the podcast, or you just let the whole thing?
Yeah.
Yeah, right. So if I were to grade your podcast, I would look for those edits. Are they clean? Do they make sense? Or does the edit make it confused, right? So there's some things that are objective, and then there's some things that are subjective. So on the subjective stuff, I don't grade as harshly because I understand, that this is me and my opinion. I'm more focused on, can I hear their fun? And again, not everybody's like very enthusiastic, right? And I'm like, oh, this is so cool, right? That's not how everybody is. I don't want people to pretend that they're like this outgoing, enthusiastic person. If they're more reserved, that's fine. I just want to make sure that what they're talking about is interesting to them, and that I can detect that I can detect their curiosity, that they are listening. that they are following up with appropriate questions and not missing out on interesting things, and that they're not going down the list of questions. If I know they're, and you can always tell when a student's going down a list of questions. Like I know you guys are looking at your paper, right, and going to your next question, and it's fine. It's not a huge deal, but I can hear that, right, if I'm listening to the podcast, and that's not something I really want to hear, right? I want to hear you follow up on the thing that I said that sparked your curiosity, not the next question. So there is, again, like I said, not to be too repetitive about this, but there are the objective things, the sound quality, the levels, the mixing, and then there's the subjective stuff, which is just how it all comes together.
What's the biggest challenge of your job?
The biggest challenge of my job, navigating higher education generally, which I could get into in depth, but I will spare you the boredom of that conversation. But it's just a different kind of world, and it's a tricky world these days, with the way the world is. And so I think just there are little political things about, being in higher education that are tricky, but I'll spare you those boring details.
What do you mean, like higher education?
So colleges and universities are, and I work at a private university, which is a little bit different from like UConn, which is a public university. So public universities are funded with taxpayer dollars for the most part, and private universities are not. So they're a lot higher tuition. You have to pay a lot more to go to private universities.
Yeah,
So
my cousin just got into Quinnipiac.
Oh, really? Oh, that's awesome. Are they going to come here?
She's still deciding because she got another scholarship for somewhere else too.
Okay. Well, we're the best. That's all I can say. Show us a podcast. You can come here. So so being in a private university today is harder because people are worried about expenses. So there are a lot of other reasons. But yeah, higher education is everything beyond high school. So, but again, private universities are different from public universities and how they're funded and all the other politics. They're a little bit different.
This is, well, not the certainly last question, but the last question of this subject. What is the most rewarding part of your job?
When students come into my office smiling, or send me a note, which doesn't happen often, I don't know how you guys are with your teachers, but it's hard to know when students really appreciate, what you're teaching or if they connect with it. But every once in a while, right? Every once in a while, I get an email or a student will stop by, and it just lifts me up because, sometimes you don't know if you're just, if anybody's listening, right? And then occasionally somebody will reach out to me and say, hey, I appreciated this, or, thank you for that. So those moments, those really, personal moments I have with students really are incredibly motivating and make me feel like, that what I do matters. And I think, anybody who gets into teaching, nobody's getting into it for the money, right? You're getting into it because you care about kids, you care about learning, you care about making a difference in people's lives and being a guide, right? And being a nurturer and assisting people find their way. So any kind of indication that I have succeeded in that coming from a student is everything to me.
Okay. This is part 3, and it is about middle school, but there is only one question about it.
Okay.
And finally, what advice would you give to middle school students today who are interested in starting their own kind of podcast?
Just start it. Just do it. I mean, I don't want to be flip about that, but first ask yourself, what is your purpose? Do you just want to have a conversation? Do you just want to have a conversation and publish it? And that's fine. Like you don't have to spend all this time on social media creating a community and promoting other podcasts and listening to other podcasts. Like that's if you want to grow and have an audience and be successful from that standard of success, right? That's one kind of success. If the other kind of success is, hey, I just want to have fun conversations. Like I don't really necessarily care who listens to it. I just want to have fun conversations and put it out there for anybody to listen to, which is fine. Like there's nothing wrong with that. So I think you ask yourself, what do you want to achieve? Is it just that? Is it just having fun conversations and putting them out there for anybody to listen to? That's totally fine. So I think if you're clear up front about your goal, like I just want to talk and have fun, then that's 100% fine. So figuring out very early why you're doing it, right? And being explicit about why you're doing it is really, really important. And then going from there and saying, okay, how serious do I want to be about the sound? Am I going to do a very bare bones? Am I just going to use my phone? Is that just going to be it? And then I'm going to upload it from there. Or am I going to use music? Am I going to use, right? And there's all different kinds of levels of complexity when it comes to podcasting, right? And you figure out what you want to do. So number one, what is the goal? Right? Why are you doing it? Number two, how is it going to sound, right? And number three, who are you talking to? Who is your audience? I think no matter what, even if you just want to have fun having a conversation, no matter what, you should define your audience. So like, if you guys are doing a podcast, like who do you guys have an intended audience for this? Like, who are you thinking about? Who listens to this? Anybody?
Well, we listen to it and our family listens to it.
Okay. So middle school students and middle school students' families would be
Yeah,
your
and some
audience.
of some teachers listen to it too.
And some teachers. Okay.
So
Go ahead. I was going to say, if it was just a podcast about, or for middle school students, if you guys were doing this and I wasn't on here, your teachers weren't on here, and your parents weren't going to listen, I bet you guys would be talking about some different stuff, right? I think you guys would be having a little bit more fun, being a little bit more goofy, a little bit more silly, a little bit more yourself. Like, you guys are very professional. Like, it's great. You guys are like, you've done your research, you're asking really smart questions. But I imagine if you guys are interviewing another middle schooler, you probably wouldn't be talking about, success in podcasting. You might be talking about whatever you guys are watching on TV or whatever like music you like, right? Or something that you're interested in as middle schoolers, because your audience would be middle schoolers. So that's also important. Who is listening? So having a very important idea of who is listening to your podcast, right? That will help you in determining how you have these conversations. So you guys know that your parents might listen to this, right? Or your teachers. So you're going to be you're going to have your best behavior, right? But again, if it was for fellow middle schoolers, you might be having a little bit more fun. So that's important too. Know who your audience is, because that determines how you're going to have your conversation, right? That's a big part of it. So that's my advice for anybody who wants to start a podcast.
Well, that concludes our discussion with David DesRoches. We truly appreciate you spending time with us today to tell us a little bit about yourself and your profession.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much, guys. This is a real treat. Thank you.
Thank you for turning in for another great episode of Rogers That. See you next time. Bye.
Bye, guys. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.